Hi everyone, this is Behzad Hashimov and this is Hashimov's Economics. We have a special guest. Our guest is Sandeep Mahajan. He's a practice manager at the World Bank. Welcome, Mr. Mahajan.
Thank you very much.
I'll introduce you to our audience. So you are a practice manager at the World Bank's Macroeconomic Trade and Investment Practice, responsible for Europe and Central Asia. And you had quite a vast experience in many parts of the world, including Asia, as in Vietnam, and also Africa and in South Africa. And today you came to Uzbekistan to attend the economic forum, and I will ask you questions about our country, your experiences in other places, and how we should think about economic development. So if you will, I'll start. So the first question is, I read your blog post about macroeconomic stability and exceptionally high returns on investment, and why they're not a sufficient condition for private investors. Why having both macroeconomic stability and pretty good returns doesn't guarantee investment interest. Can you elaborate that a little bit?
Yeah. So Behzad, first of all, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I've heard a lot about you and about the platform that you're running here, and you're doing a great service to the people here who are interested in the topic of development. So the blog post you were mentioning was written in reference to South Africa, and what we found was that the economic returns to private investment. This is not portfolio investment. This is real investment, FDI. So the economic returns to investment have been increasing very sharply since the end of apartheid. Mm-hmm. And the government had done a great job of maintaining macroeconomic stability, and yet the private sector response was very weak. So it was a conundrum that you would expect that private investors can make more money now in South Africa, and yet they're not coming in. So where it came down to really is that investment looks at two things. It looks at returns, and it looks at risks. And in South Africa, while the returns had gone up, the risks had gone up even more. So that offset the returns that the investors could expect to make in the country, and which basically explained why private investment was not responding to that opportunity.
Can we take your model about risks and returns, which I think is quite consensual? I think many people would agree that if the returns are high but risks are commensurately high, right, then there is no point of saying that returns are high. And one thing I think about quite a bit about Uzbekistan is how high the returns are here. Like if you go to a commercial bank and you deposit your cash even in the US dollars, I think you can get something like 5 to 8% return, which is basically riskless because it's also almost insured and so on. And if you go to the US, for example, and you want to deposit money to a local bank, I think like 0.5% would be a steal. Like nobody would give you 0.5%, even if you put like $1 million. And the economic understanding should be it's like an arbitrage, right? Like banks could borrow from places where the returns are low and invest in high places, but that's not happening. And so how would you explain that risk premium? Like in South Africa, I think, I'm quite underread in that, but like I think it was also security issues and it's not a very sort of safe place, I would say. But Uzbekistan is quite safe. Like how would you explain that?
So the two countries are very different. Yeah. I mean, you're right. The security was a big concern there. The legacy of apartheid is a big issue there. Transportation costs are very high, so on and so forth. I think Uzbekistan is a different case. The environment, the policy environment we see here is very positive. When I compare the growth rates in Uzbekistan and South Africa, Uzbekistan does much better. There's far higher growth rate here than what you had in South Africa.
But lower base though.
Lower base though, that's right. So there is a convergence happening in that sense. But you're right. I mean, the risk factors are there, and policy is changing. And I think the investors, though, to some extent, have a watch and wait approach. That they want to see how policy plays out, They want to see how, where it will stabilize before they make their investment decisions. And I think partially this is also the case with savers. When they're looking at saving opportunities in banks, they're looking for a longer track record, right? I mean, there is a history of mistrust towards the formal financial sector here. It will take time to overcome that.
But if you go to informal sector as well, the rates of return there are also quite enormous. Like a growth of say 20% a year in a business is quite conservative numbers. If you talk to people, some businesses grow like 3 digits a year, which is quite crazy. But if you look at sort of aggregate numbers, like say FDIs in a year, like let's talk about pre-pandemic years. Even in pre-pandemic years, the maximum FDI that we got in our history basically was comparable to that of Georgia, which is 10 times smaller country, which 30% of it is occupied by foreign force. I mean, it's a very, very different place.
Yeah.
And the absolute numbers are sort of incomparable. So I don't know how to think about this conundrum, meaning we are basically starving for cash, if you will, and the market is not supplying it. And I want to know what's your take on this.
So let's break it down, right? The savings rate in Uzbekistan are 25% or 26%. The investment rate is about 32%. So there is a savings investment gap that you need to fill. Part of it is getting filled by FDI. I think the government is doing a good job in being able to borrow in international debt markets as well. But I would say 25% savings rate is pretty good.
For a poor country, yeah.
For any country, to be able to save this much, I think in 2008 there was a Growth Commission report, and they looked at the example of all the successful countries who had been able to maintain 7% growth over a period of 30 years, and I think they came up with a list of 7 countries or so. And one of the characteristics they identified for maintaining strong growth over a long period of time were high savings rate and investment rates. And and the minimum savings rate was 25% to be able to maintain high growth rate. So I think Uzbekistan is starting from a good, strong base in having a savings rate of 25%. Maybe it can be increased to 30%, 35%. But you're right. I think it's important to get foreign investment as well, not just for the money, which is important to fill the balance of payment gap, but more, I would say, for the technological benefits and the managerial benefits and the markets it opens up when you get that kind of investment. Now, to your question, why FDI is relatively low and sluggish, it's pretty normal. I mean, when you look at countries across the world, there's a lag between when you start reforming and when the investment starts reacting to it, right? Investors always will wait a little bit to make sure that the reforms are going to be consistent and they're going to be stable and they're there to stay and it's not going to change. Having said that, I think there is a good response that we see in some sectors in Uzbekistan, in agro processing for sure, right, where investors are starting to come in. And that's the way to build the success for future, by doing well in the sectors where investment is coming in. You show a good track record, you show good returns for those investors, you show good outcomes. Outcomes are very important. You show job creation, exports and all that, which will then create a positive dynamic for more investment to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of share your optimism about the country, but also want to hear your take on, how can I say, the price of capital, if you will, right? Like typically when we think about returns on investment, that's the price of money, right? Like, and I think if you put like the supply and demand hat on here, the high price of capital that we see here, I think has to do with not sufficient supply of the capital, and it's so extreme that if you are an agro-processing firm which works in Uzbekistan versus if you are the same firm that does exactly the same thing and you go 10 kilometers from Tashkent, which becomes Kazakhstan, the rate of price of capital is dramatically different.
Yeah.
and it's only like you can see like a one firm from another firm. It's like not too far. Like you can go to a border, and it's very almost the same type of people live in both sides of the border. I mean, they all look the same. The climate is there aren't too many sort of variables except there's like a social construct called border, and that's the thing I think quite a lot about. Like, is the convergence not happening even within sort of a region? How would you think about that?
I think that's a very good observation. So I would say two things, right? One, I think the cost of capital is high because inflation is much higher in Uzbekistan.
But in dollars, though, like if you take away the inflation part and sums.
So let me ask you this: what is the dollar borrowing rate or lending rate in Uzbekistan? Would you know?
So I think it's above like 7%.
Okay.
So it's 10. I mean, depends on how do you borrow. Like if you borrow informally,
right.
It's like 12 to 18%, right? If you borrow from the bank,
if it's
low.
through formal sectors, it's 7%. I would say it's not very high. I mean, typically if you get if a company can get 3, 4, 5% borrowing cost, that's really good, right?
Yeah.
So yes, it can be lower, but I think I wouldn't panic based on those numbers.
But it's like fully collateralized. The way to get borrowing in dollars, for example. Right now, I think the government doesn't want us to borrow in dollars for the foreign exchange risks and stuff like that. They are thinking about if the firm doesn't have revenues in dollars, they don't want them having a forex exposure. Right? I mean, I think it's kind of a smart thing. To do. But I mean, having said that, borrowing from Uzbek bank is almost, again, it sounds like quite riskless, meaning, you have to collateralize quite a bit, and it's almost guaranteed that they will get their returns back. So
I think I see a couple of things, right? I mean, when I mentioned that the savings rate is 26% and the investment rate is 32%, not all the savings rate is being intermediated into the investment because the financial intermediation right now is still weak. The banking sector is still dominated by the state-owned banks, the private sector banks, and the risk methodologies are still being developed. And you're comparing with Kazakhstan, which has a more mature system, which has been in place for a longer time, where banking relationships have been in place for a longer time. And as you know very well, these interest rates and these borrowing costs go down as you have a record of relationship between banks and companies, right? And I think once that the other aspect of it is obviously competition in the banking sector, right? If you have a semi-monopolistic oligopoly system, they will go for captured markets where the returns are safe. They will not go for more risky investments. So more competition, more private banks coming in. They will be much more entrepreneurial.
I see. So let's talk about trade. That's one of the things that you are interested in. And I write quite a bit of op-eds and stuff about trade. And why I do that, it's not because I think about the trade all the time. It's because I was almost forced to think about it because Uzbekistan is a double landlocked country in which all of our neighbors are also landlocked country, which is quite unique in the world. It's probably the only place except probably Liechtenstein, I think, but it's in the European Union, so they don't have borders, right? Which means the transport costs are high. On top of that, we have these bureaucratic costs, which are quite high. There used to be some ratings that sort of rank that bureaucratic costs. On top of that, we have very high tariffs comparable to our neighbors. I mean Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And on top of that, we're not part of the WTO, and we're not part of many other sort of treaties and trade agreements, which makes our country almost like a textbook autarky example in the modern world. I mean, modern world is different from the world of 100 years ago, before the trade and stuff, and it's quite autarkic. But although we're so sort of far away from this free trade equilibria, people, both in the government and also sort of in the public sphere, are very much against sort of opening up the trade. And so my question is, let's talk about each of those things, like bureaucracy, transport costs, and tariffs separately, and how they affect growth. And then we'll go to the political economy of it. How do you think about trade?
So I would characterize it a little bit differently than what you have, right? Okay. I think there is still some ways to go, but I would also recognize the very strong progress that's been made since 2017.
Oh yeah.
Right? I mean, Uzbekistan used to be an autarkic economy. It's no longer, right? At that point, the average tariff rate was 15%. Today, it's actually fallen by half, right? So it's 7.5%. The country has submitted an application for WTO accession, which I think is a very significant move because it ties in Uzbekistan to a very important process of committing itself to trade openness. Right? But I think you touched upon a really important topic. Trade openness is extremely important for any country, but a country like Uzbekistan, which is
small,
30 million people, 60 billion GDP. Especially when you measure it against the growth objectives of the country. When you want to grow at 10% a year, which is the objective that you see in Uzbekistan, then export orientation, trade orientation is a necessary condition for that. When you look at the countries which have been able to grow at that rate, whether you look at Korea, even China, which is Vietnam, right, or even China, which is actually a really large country and large market, have relied on export markets, and that's going to be very important for Uzbekistan. No, you're right. I mean, I think there's the hurdle of double landlockedness, which has to be overcome, but it's not insurmountable. If you look at some of the horticulture exports that Uzbekistan has been making all the way to South Korea or Germany, it's not insurmountable, right? Transport cost is, I would say, 5% of total cost. So it's something where it puts you at a disadvantage, but you can make it up by being more competitive in other ways.
Look, but if you go out and say to people that exports are good, as a general euphemism, I wouldn't say you find a lot of people who disagree with that. Although government does have been and it still does limit exports in some things. They think that if we let some of the agriculture to be exported, the prices in the local markets will rise and it will make people unhappy and so on. So they occasionally sort of close borders. But overall, since 2017, as you sort of noted, this isn't happening like as it used to, right? But one thing I'm quite worried about is that although people think exports are good, they think imports are bad. And in that sense, how would you think about sort of persuading people that imports and exports are almost exactly the same thing? There's some symmetries between them, and you can't really grow exports with like limiting imports. It's mathematically impossible. So like I have trouble communicating that. Like what's your take? How would your take be on that?
I would say exactly what you said, that you cannot have exports without imports. That just to be able to export, you need intermediate goods and raw material that you have to import. And that's part of the whole global value chain, and you have to be part of the global value chain. In fact, one of the benefits of exports is that it gives you the foreign exchange to be able to import.
I mean, it's a purpose, I think. I mean,
one of the main purposes
is to get money.
It also makes your companies more competitive because they have to compete outside, and it sharpens their competitive edge. But as Uzbekistan develops, there is going to be a need for a lot of capital goods, a lot of capital investment, and a lot of those capital goods have to be imported, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Every successful country in the world has done it. So why not Uzbekistan? If it gives you high growth and jobs, right? Which is the objective of the country.
Yeah, so that's something I think about quite a bit, and one conclusion that I sort of came across was that if you open up to trade, there will be winners and losers, obviously, and then those who lose are much more concentrated than those who win, right? Like if tomorrow the government lifts a ban on, I'm calling it a ban, but it's actually a tax, right? So one thing about you just mentioned earlier about the 7.5% average tariff, this is sort of something that we observe ex post, not ex ante, meaning some things have such a high tariffs that are not calculated in the average one because the average weighted one is like once it makes sense to bring. Like some goods, it was ridiculous. Like some ice creams were like 300% tax rate.
A lot of water in tariff. There's a lot of water in tariff.
Yeah. So that sort of tariffs, I mean, how can I say? It basically prevents imports, which makes the average tariff look meager. And I think, I don't know a good way actually of measuring tariff, because if you measure it by number of goods and then tariff rate, the average is uninformative. If you do the weighting by ex-post imports, it is also quite uninformative, because it's sort of endogenous to what people are importing. I mean, if you put them, too high, nobody's going to import it, and so that thing is not captured in the average weighted one. I don't know how to think about it properly, but again, the political economy of it worries me, and I want to hear your take on how we should think about it. Like, because people don't really care, I think, if sugar will become 1 cent cheaper, but people who are making money on the sugar tariffs care a lot about it.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to think about it.
It's a tough question, right? I mean, this is a question that even in the U.S. is struggling with. That a lot of industries have suffered because of trade liberalization, because it's good for the country, but it's bad for some groups. And how do you handle it? And I think the economics profession has been behind on this so far. You always hear in the economics profession, yes, you have to take care of the losers, you have to have transfer systems,
redistribution or something, yeah.
But in practice, you don't see that happening. So I would say that having a system of social protection which actually addresses the losers from reforms is very important, right? And that has to be one of the preconditions for making the reform happen, and recognizing that that's an issue. Part of this support for the losers in the reform has to be also to retrain them for moving
jobs.
to the opportunities that are going to open up. So it has to be thought about comprehensively, but it's a tricky issue. I agree with that, because as you said, the political economy is very challenging as well, because the losers are concentrated because they have a lot to lose per person.
Yeah.
And the losers and the winners are diffuse. So their incentive to come together is much less than the winners' incentive to come together. These things have to be carefully managed. So it's difficult to do anything very suddenly. Now this is where the Vietnam experience, by the way, becomes relevant, where every reform, including trade liberalization, but privatization, everything, had a lot of consensus building in the system, where everybody's views were taken into account, and the speed of the reforms was conditioned by consensus building. So there's nothing wrong in building consensus and making sure that you have enough consensus, enough people behind the reform to build momentum and to make it stay, so that you don't have to reverse reforms later on.
How do they build consensus? Like, was it they liberalize their political sphere? How do they do it?
So they have a very they have a complicated system. It's a communist country, but the Communist Party itself has very diffuse power. It's a very decentralized Communist Party, where local branches of the Communist Party also have a lot of sway. So across the Communist Party system, building consensus, it's not something that one person decides. It's something that the party itself decides. And building consensus within the party is a very elaborate process, because people come with their own views, and those views are aired within the system. And only when the consensus is built across the whole system do they go forward with the reforms.
You foreshadowed one of the questions that I wanted to ask you. It's again about sort of hard reforms, the reforms that are necessarily but not popular. And one of it was a lot of things in Uzbekistan was underpriced. And I personally took it as my sort of a duty to write about it in the public sphere. And for example, I wrote about that the price of gasoline is underpriced, and we used to have lines. And they sort of liberalized it, and a lot of people understand by liberalization, things will be more expensive. Reforms means things will going to get expensive. And one thing that is very important right now is price of energy. So electricity, and other sort of water even, utilities, gas and so on, they're all underpriced. And we as a society spend exorbitant amount of money subsidizing our energy. And I think this is quite bad because I mean it's quite regressive, right? I mean people who consume more tend to be richer, and if you consume. But when you talk about it, you sound like a ridiculous person who says like people should suffer. Meaning like, I mean, if you go out and say, you know, our electricity is underpriced, people will like jump on you saying like, how can you say so? Our incomes are so low. But what I really meant is, for example, that we spend more on electricity subsidies than we spend on education or other things. And so, but like, it's so politically unpopular that nobody wants to deal with it, and it sort of gets exacerbated. So how would you think about, you know, talking about those things without bearing the political cost? Do you think like we should, you know, compensate them with cash? Like how would you think about it or design those policies that are necessary, in my opinion, to move country forward, but politically costly?
Yeah. So again, it's a complicated, complex policy matter. But I think you're absolutely right that a lot of the subsidy actually goes to people who don't need the subsidy, who are, you know, well off. And continuing that subsidy is regressive. So it doesn't make any sense to do that, right? Now, how do you build a system where you still protect the poor people, for whom it's a big deal to pay more for heating, for example, right, and energy and all that, and at the same time not do it for the rich? So typically, I mean, it's very country specific, but typically what you would see is that you would have to raise energy prices to cost plus, at least recovery of cost. And at the same time, have some form of social protection where well-targeted support for the poor, either through cash transfers or through some basic level of tariff where, you know, people below a certain income level pay lower tariffs and above pay higher, would be the way to go, right?
So let me tell you about one experiment which was quite niche in Uzbekistan, and I think I think it's
called social tariff, by the way, that up to like 150 or 200 kilowatt hours.
That's exactly what they did.
Right.
So So in one of the districts in Tashkent, they priced the electricity with a step function in which if you consume less than 300, you pay less, and if you consume more than 300, you pay a lot. And I think more than 90% of the households in that district consumed less than 300. But if you looked at the so we, after 2017, we got
300 is high.
It's very high.
So
it's extremely high.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Because, you know, one thing I thought at that time, especially at that time, with the price of gasoline and the price of electricity, was that most of the country was experiencing severe shortages of both electricity and the gasoline. Like people used to have diesel generators to just put electricity in their homes. They had electricity for a couple of hours. But having said that, the price of non-existent electricity was going up, and then people were furious about it.
Exactly.
And I was like, there should be a way of doing it, because, you know, it can't be sustainable when you spend so much of the public funds on such an extreme regressive measures like.
No, I agree with that. But again, I will go back and say that if the only thing you're doing is making people pay more, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But if at the same time, if you're also working on the supply side, bringing in more competition, you know, and making the supply side more efficient and better, I think you're going to help the reform process that way.
So let's shift our gears a little bit and talk about size and the scope of the government. So one thing I always sort of want to emphasize is both in stocks and flows, the share of the government is really high. And I'm worried more about stocks than flows. But I mean, you know, flows are also problematic, but, you know, stocks are where I think the main problem is. So how should we think about privatization? What do you think are potential, you know, challenges that may arise with privatization, and how should we make it sort of inclusive in a way that a lot of people will buy in, if you will. Like, we just talk about commodity prices. Like, a lot of people are not buying into that reforms. How to make people sort of buy into privatization?
So you're right. I think the presence of the state is pretty large here. When you look at the size of the budget, implicitly or explicitly, the government spends about 35% of GDP, which for this income level is quite high. And then when you include the role of the SOEs, 50% of GDP is accounted by the state, and almost 20% of employment is, right, which is large. That's a starting point, and you want to start moving away from it because you want to start redefining the role of the state. And the role of the state is going to remain important, by the way. So, I disagree with people who say less government and more private sector. I would say there's a very important role for the private sector, and there's a very important role for the government, and it's a question of defining it. Now, insofar as the privatization is concerned, it has to be done right. I think there are a lot of examples in the world where this process was rushed and the outcomes were not good because the market institutions were not in place, and you privatize, and what you got in the end was basically private oligarchic structures, which is not what you want, right? You want to make sure that you get a competitive outcome in the end. And you also want to make sure that you do it in a way that you get good outcomes. The one outcome that you need in Uzbekistan today, and privatization, private participation, is going to be very important for that, is jobs, right? Unemployment in Uzbekistan is very high. It's in double digits. And you want to make sure that privatization is an important instrument for job creation. Let me give you one more example from Vietnam, right? Now Vietnam, still has a lot of state-owned enterprises, but they've been privatizing for the last 15, 20 years. But one strange phenomenon we found in Vietnam was that the average productivity of the private sector was lower than the average productivity of the public sector. So it's not good enough to go from public to private when your private is not performing, right? And that's because they were not doing as well in building the market institutions to support the private sector. And I think that's something to watch out here, that you want to privatize, but to a private sector which is a strong performer, is a stronger performer than the public sector. It creates jobs, it creates employment, it creates export as well. So, I think the government is discussing these things. There are laws being framed along these lines. It is an incremental approach. I think it's been 4 years. The privatization can, we would like to see a little bit more push on that, but I wouldn't rush the process either. It'll be a great thing to start with the smaller companies, to privatize little, two people shops that there's no reason for the government to be running garages, for example, right? So start with that.
This bookstore is government owned, by the way.
Okay. So that's another example, right? So you have 2,800 SOEs, I think, right now. I mean, a lot of them are going to be small mom and pop kind of SOEs. Privatize them, but the bigger ones, I think you need to be more deliberate that you're attracting the right kind of private investment.
But even in privatization, there is a political economy lens, because although it's not like an oligarchy right now, people who sort of operate and work in SOEs, they get skewed benefits, if you will, that are much higher, and they want to preserve the status quo. I mean, I'm talking about things like transportation, for example. Like if you fly to Uzbekistan from anywhere in the world, it's very expensive. I mean, it's much more expensive than anywhere in the region as well.
Yeah.
Although it's quite a large country, it's quite a large market in terms of like just airlines, the railroads and so on and so forth. And you see that people who sort of work for those state-owned enterprises, their justification comes like, oh, we have so much employment, so we want to, keep, the airlines working. That's why we'll force our competitors, even the foreign firms, to keep the prices high so that we're not out of business. And I think if there is a political will to privatize, and then I think if we're slow, then the concentrated losers, the potential losers, will have a lot more time and effort to build up the momentum to stall the reforms.
Yeah.
And I think I saw this quite a bit of times in our recent history. So I don't know how to think about rapidity. Like sometimes I feel like is like speed important, and the answer is probably kind of coming to yes. But the jury is still out. Like I'm open if you like persuade me that we should go slower.
Yeah. So speed is important.
Yeah.
You want to have a momentum in it, but you only privatize once. You don't privatize
Exactly.
10 times.
Yeah.
So you want to do it right as well,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you don't want to hand it over to, you don't want to hand over an airline business to people who don't know how to run airline business. So you don't want to hand over airlines to somebody running a banking sector, for example, right? So you do want to make sure that you're doing it right. But again, it goes back to the point we were discussing earlier, that the question of winners and losers has to be thought through carefully, right? I mean, there will be job losses in sectors when you implement reforms, and I think thinking of packages for losers is not a bad idea as long as it helps you promote the reform. But the larger good has to be kept in mind as well. The case you just mentioned, the consumers in Uzbekistan are paying for rents in one sector, which is preventing job creation in other sectors, right? So it's an important reform. It has to be done, but it has to be done carefully.
Let me talk about one specific thing about the way World Bank operates, and I think I want to know like sort of how does it work, the inner sort of kitchen of it, and we know that developing countries should discover their competitive advantages, and the external parties like the World Bank, they fund sometimes specific projects in specific industries. And don't you think it's kind of preventing the market to do its magic in a way that people who are in DC or Tashkent office, with all due respect or whatever, they decide on to sort of where to allocate the investments and not the market. How would you think about that?
I think that's a very good question. It's a very fair question. So our operating principle now, whether or not we implement it, to perfection, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But our operating principle is that where there's a competitive market, where the private sector can do the job, is not an area where we want to get in. We only get in where we think there's a market failure, where we think that either the cost of private financing is too exorbitantly high, or it's not there at all. And through our participation, we actually open, the ground for future private investment in that sector. Is the way I would see it. Now, the market failure could also be the social returns could be much higher than the private returns.
Like education or something, right?
Like education.
Social returns are quite high.
That's a great example, right? Where private investment is, often reluctant because the private returns are not
as high as social ones, right?
Which is where we find, a niche for ourselves because we think the social returns are exceptionally high.
I see. So why I'm asking this question is one of the sectors that employs a lot of people in Uzbekistan, but it's also very unproductive. Like is agriculture, right? So like almost half of the population is rural, and a lot of people supposed to be working in that sector, but it's extremely unproductive, and it's very command economy-ish, right? Like farmers basically can't decide for themselves what sort of crops they would how can I say? I mean, I need to be very careful with sort of what I say now. But so, how does the agricultural command economy works here? Is from Tashkent, every region will get orders of specific commodities or goods to be produced, and then the local government or local governor's office would give to the local farmers what they have to produce. And if they don't produce, government has a lot of leverage over them, up to the point, or I think especially to the point, that they would take away their lands because there is this rental agreement between the farmer and the government for 50 years, which government routinely breaks the contracts and saying like, oh, we told you have to get us wheat, but you're planting tomatoes, so good luck with that. And you don't need even a court order, right? Like once the You don't even need a prosecutor's order basically for that. So like the way that farmers operate, they're basically like in a communistic state. And the World Bank is very involved in agriculture. And so if I would criticize the World Bank, people would say like the fact that this, not only World Bank by the way, many international financial institutions and even the charity institutions and NGOs and whatever, they're involved in helping with the productivity of the agricultural sector, by which they exacerbate the process in which the government still keeps it. Like, there's incremental help they get, and they never want to let it go because they get this technical assistance, they get some funding to keep the show rolling. So how would you think about that?
So let me preface anything I say by saying I'm not an agricultural specialist. I mean, you know more about agriculture than I do.
No, I mean, I know a little bit about Uzbekistan only, not like
but let me, a couple of things, right? When you said agriculture in Uzbekistan is very unproductive, which may be true. I mean, it needs to be more productive. But we are economists, so I'm going to give you some numbers. When I look at Vietnam, which is a higher income than Uzbekistan, slightly, right? So, and has gone through a transition process as well. 40% of the workforce works in agriculture, producing less than 20% of GDP. Okay. In Uzbekistan, 1/4 of the workforce works in agriculture, producing 1/4 of GDP. So it's a more productive scenario here than in some other countries, right? The picture you painted shows that there is a long way to go, right? But I wouldn't say that the changes have been incremental. A lot of the changes that have happened in agriculture, and we can talk about what more needs to happen, but a lot of the changes are not incremental. The role of the government in deciding what the farmers produce, how much they produce, and what price they sell, has been shrinking dramatically. I mean, you know that the price of wheat has been liberalized.
The price is liberalized.
Farm gate sales have been liberalized to the extent, I think the next step probably is going to be where all farm gate, at the farm gate, the farmers will be free to sell to whoever they want. Now, one remaining issue is how much land is allocated to wheat and cotton. Almost 70% of land is still allocated to wheat and cotton, and I think that remains an issue. It's been decreasing, but obviously that needs to be accelerated, so farmers can get more income.
So when we talk about the scope of the government, what I really meant was also like sort of political constraints to the governmental power. So if the government makes a contract with the farmer for the 50 years of usage of the land and so on, but also, government at every level has this leverage on like, oh, we can take away your land if we wish so.
That's a big issue, I agree.
It's not that they do it, it's just like the existence of it.
Sometimes they do it too, by the way.
I mean, they do it, but like what I'm saying is even if they did it occasionally, I mean, they do it quite often. What I'm saying is it's bad even if they did it occasionally, because it's just like having
property rights, the security of land ownership or land use is very, very important for farmers to take, to put the investments, long-term investments that they need to put in to get more productivity. I think it's a critical reform. It's a very critical reform. And my sense is that the government is actually taking it seriously. So hopefully we'll see results in the coming years.
So how does this relate to the World Bank's business? I know that in some industries like livestock or animal producing and so on, World Bank does investments in Uzbekistan. So do you think there was a market failure that World Bank gets involved in this? Like, how does this
you are now drawing me out into areas which are beyond my competitive advantage. So I won't be able to get into that level of detail.
So how do you think of this? I mean, I hear it a lot, and especially in the post-Soviet countries, there is this vilification of this so-called Washington consensus, which I'm not sure it exists as a model, but like almost everybody knows what it generally means, right? Like a freer trade, more property rights, and there independent central banking, and there's like a laundry list of stuff, which in my opinion is quite sane, right? Like I don't feel I particularly hate that Washington Consensus. But if you read, especially like Russian blogosphere and press, like there's a lot of vilification of it. Like, how would you think, as a person who works for the World Bank and who is sort of represents those Washington Consensus in the eyes of, I think, a lot of people in Uzbekistan as well. I think the main argument that people don't like about international financial institutions is that, you know, they help you to reform the economy, but they conflate the economic reforms with liberalization of political sphere. And so, do you
of the political sphere?
Yeah. Do you think they really go hand in hand? And do you think that, say, the bank, the World Bank, cares about it?
Okay, so you've thrown a lot of questions at me there. One is Washington Consensus, and one is political reforms together with economic reforms, which is not the same thing. So Washington Consensus is very maligned because it's also misunderstood, as you also alluded to, right? Washington Consensus means, you know, liberalizing prices, macroeconomic stability, which is there's nothing wrong with it, but it was never devised as an instrument for all development. It was devised in the context of Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s for macroeconomic stability, and I would argue that these principles are still important for macroeconomic stability. But I would say these are macroeconomic stability through these principles is a necessary condition for development, but not sufficient, right? And so if all you do is the Washington Consensus and stop at that, then I think you will not get necessarily good results. So, you know, this is one step towards, but there's a lot of supporting institutional reforms that need to go with it.
So I think the way they vilify Washington Consensus is also is also political. So like the actual, as you said, the actual Washington Consensus is quite malign, and it's not extreme way of saying it, but like the Washington Consensus that people define in this part of the world, at least, is like, oh, this foreign institutions like the UN and so on, they have their agenda of, you know, development and helping education and, you know, whatnot, but also they want liberalization of political sphere, which, I mean, again, I don't agree with it, but I just want to hear your opinion.
I want to clarify that in our charters, we don't get into the political reforms. I mean, we work with the political systems that are in place. We've been working in China for 40 years, exactly with the political system they have in place. We have been working in Vietnam or India. I mean, they're very different political systems. So there is no precondition in the kind of political system we can work with. We work in all kinds of political systems within those systems, respecting the norms of those systems. And political reforms is not something that we get into as an institution. We get into economic reforms, we get into development issues, but not political reforms.
I see. So World Bank thinks, I mean, if you go to their office or if you go to their website, they talk about eliminating poverty and thinking about poverty. And have you looked at sort of poverty numbers in Uzbekistan? Do you think like Uzbekistan is being challenged by poverty, or we're like already sort of graduated from that stage?
Uzbekistan, I think, confirms the analysis that we see at the global level, which is that the strongest force for poverty reduction is economic growth. Economic growth, despite the limitations in Uzbekistan, has been strong in the last 20 years, and we've seen it in the poverty numbers. The poverty rate, I don't have the exact numbers with me, but it has fallen from high 20s to something like 10%, right? So over the last 20 years. So poverty has been reducing. Now, one impediment to poverty reduction, even faster poverty reduction, is what I had mentioned before, which is the progress on job creation has been very slow. And that has to change. I think the job creation part, more employment, better employment, is going to be very important for further gains in poverty reduction.
I see. Let's say you have, you're like, how can I say? Let's say you can implement one reform that you think has the highest sort of bang per buck in Uzbekistan that you understand so far. What would you think that would be? Like, let's imagine that there's only like one thing you can do. Like, would it be, you know, liberalizing trade? Would it be liberalizing commodity market prices, energy? Like what would be your sort of one policy thing?
I think it's a very difficult question because, you know, often when you look at some economies, you see that there is one distortion, right?
Yeah.
Everything else is in place, but there's one distortion which is creating low growth. Or in Uzbekistan, especially in a transition process, I think one reform is not going to do it because there's so many complementarities that have to happen on the financial sector, because you need credit, you need de-licensing, you need export reforms because you need markets. So it's very difficult to identify. But if you ask me, where I would really like to see progress in the next couple of years, not at the cost of everything else, by the way, because everything else is important too, I would say agriculture. I think because that's the core strength of Uzbekistan, and that's where also you've seen really good results in the last 3-4 years. Incomes have gone up, big impact on poverty reduction, good export response, and I think there's a lot of potential there. That has to continue. And so related to that, land reforms, right? Because you're not going to get more agricultural productivity until you have reforms on land market liberalization along the lines we discussed earlier.
I see. Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation. I think we're almost at time. Thank you so much for being our guest. It was a very interesting talk, and I think
it's my pleasure.
There's a lot to unpack here, and I'll look forward to talking to you more and thinking about what you have said. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Begzal.
Thank you.